most people are not great about remembering that there was a human being who took the time to put something together, to put it on the system for others to share. It seems like a computer brought it to them, and they don't thank the computer. It's all part of the way that we interact with our devices and such. It's hard for people to maintain the usual patterns of social behavior when they're dealing with things on the computer. It's not the only example of that. Whoop, hold on. That was weird. Sorry. Trying to organize things a bit.
I see that you saw the explanation about the person that I added in the Dafyomi WhatsApp.
Yes. Yeah, okay, great. Good. More people for the Dafyomi is great.
No, he's a nice person. He's, I think, 60 something, 65 maybe, or more, but nice guy.
Good afternoon, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi.
How are you doing?
Good. How you been?
I've been okay, enjoying Shavuot, and now back into the regular mix of things.
Hey, Rabbi, at the last sermon, how you were saying that synagogue had such a low rating of importance among most Jewish people. Mm-hmm. Things like the Holocaust and supporting Israel had a high level of importance.
Again, that's not me saying that. That was me quoting the latest Pew survey.
Pew survey, yeah. Was there anybody who thought that was due to the amount of effort it took? Because it obviously takes very little, I shouldn't say very little, it's a lower amount of effort usually when people support the Holocaust, but going to service obviously takes more effort. And I think you see more people show up for Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah than you do for the Holocaust remembrance services.
So, that's the great thing about doing demography is you can get some interesting data and lovely numbers that make for great articles and newspaper clippings and all of those things. But really, if you need to dig down, it takes a much longer time to do those studies. And those are much harder to come by because they're not as flashy as doing the general surveys. But I mean, that's certainly a reasonable supposition. It all depends on what level of engagement we're talking about. I mean, you make a good point that going to services every week is obviously going to take more than somebody saying, I feel very committed in my Judaism because of honoring the memory of those who died in the Holocaust. The form of honor that a person gives for the Holocaust could be just thinking about it once in a while, or simply refusing not to stop identifying as being Jewish, or it could be volunteering at a Holocaust center, or teaching other people about the Holocaust, or donating large amounts of money. The range is huge, but that survey question in particular only asked what for you is an essential part of your Jewish identity. So you're right, further study is needed.
Rabbi, I will be absent for 7 minutes and come back, okay?
7 minutes, that's very precise.
No, because they want to start eating dinner and they ask me if I can be with them. So I will eat very, very, very fast and I will come back. So I will turn off the camera because I think it's not nice to see empty chair, okay? But I will be here in 7 minutes.
It's Kisei Eliyahu, so it's okay.
Exactly.
All right, so let's go ahead and get down to work. We have one more Mishnah from chapter 11 left over, and then we will move on to chapter 12. Ironically enough, chapter 12 is going to seem like it's dealing with all of the details that people probably wanted in chapter 1. But like we've discussed before, the Mishnah was not edited to take you from 0 to 100% knowledge. It was edited based upon a different rubric of reminders for people that should have already learned this in a oral academy. So Mishnah 7, however, does have a very logical place. It is essentially combining the issues of Mishnahs 4, 5, and 6, meaning when you have a child that is of uncertain lineage, In this case, we are going to combine the issue of we're not sure who the father is. It may have been from a late pregnancy or an early pregnancy, going back to the previous Mishnah where the remarriage took place too soon, and the prior Mishnah, which talked about the person might be a Kohen or might not be a Kohen, meaning the father of the child, meaning thus the child. So with that in mind, that we are continuing on from Mishnah 6, where we have a woman who remarried a little early before we could definitively say the child did not belong to the previous husband, or does belong definitively to the new husband. But now we're going to mix that up a little bit with the identity of the husbands, something that wasn't really focused on in Mishnah 6. So, let me scroll this down. If one of his two uncertain fathers was an Israelite and one was a priest, here's our topic. Perhaps she was married originally to an Israelite, then divorced, or he died, remarried a non-Israelite, but a Kohen, but it was within that 3-month period when there really shouldn't have been a marriage in order to clear up any paternity issues. First one was an Israelite, second one was a Kohen, or reversed. First one was a Kohen, second one was an Israelite, but either way, we can't tell for sure what the child is. Well, in such a situation, he may marry only a woman fit to marry a priest, due to the possibility that he is a priest, as we saw in the earlier Mishnah dealing with the issue of mixed up children. And he may not become ritually impure with impurity imparted by a corpse, because he might be a priest. So he could be a priest, he could be an Israelite, but he is being saddled with the requirements both for marriage as well as for maintaining purity as though he were a priest. But on the other hand, if he became impure, if he did become ritually impure, in particular in this case because of contact with a body, he does not receive the 40 lashes, which would be the normal punishment for a Kohen who does this in violation of the law, as he might be a non-priest, and we can't whip him on a maybe. We can prevent him on a maybe, but we can't punish him on a maybe. Likewise, he does not partake of truma in case he is a non-priest. We can't let him eat something that is reserved only for the Kohanim, because he might not be one. However, if he ate the truma, he does not pay the principal and add the additional fifth, as he might be a priest. So again, he is not supposed to do this, but he is also not punished if he does do it, because it might be perfectly legitimate for him to do it. And same idea, he does not receive truma at the granary. However, he may sell the truma of his own produce, that is to say, the part of the produce that he sets aside as truma to give to a Kohen. He can just sell it. He can't eat it because he might not be a priest, but he can sell it because it might be his, right? And the money that he makes from selling it is his. It cannot be taken away from him due to the uncertainty with regard to his status. And he does not receive a share of the consecrated offerings at the temple, and one may not give him the consecrated offerings to sacrifice because he might not be a priest. And if you're not a priest, you're not allowed to do that job. However, the hides of his own offerings, meaning if he has an offering that is dedicated for the temple, they may not be appropriated from his possession. You can't take it away from him. All of this should sound very familiar to our earlier discussion. Whereas in the previous case, it was dealing with 2 children and then adults. Here we are dealing with 1 child, but with the dual parentage question. In both cases, most of these rulings are going to seem very, very similar. With me so far? All right. I just scroll down to make it easier to position on the screen. And he is exempt from giving a priest and in general, we place upon him the stringencies of priests and the stringencies of Israelites. So most of that should have seemed quite familiar from our earlier discussion. However, now we move on to case number 2, a different set of fathers. So, if both uncertain fathers were priests, meaning she was married to Kohen number 1, and then she got married to Kohen number 2, but too soon, and thus we're not sure which one of them was the actual father, but we know that one of them was the father, then if they die, he is in a state of acute mourning over each of them, in case the deceased is his father. He does become an onen for both of them, because he knows that one of them is his father, and thus he must mourn for both of them. And if he dies, meaning if the child in question dies, they, meaning both of the different fathers, are in a state of acute mourning over him, as one of them is his father. So they can't say, well, maybe he's the father, maybe he's the father. Instead, they say, if we both mourn, then his father will have mourned. This section reminded me very much of the movie Mamma Mia, based off the ABBA albums, of having too many different people who could be the father. And in a way, you can actually have more than one father, or at least you and the fathers can, in different situations, undertake certain parts of the duties to our parents, even though it's clearly doubling up. Let me just scroll one more time. However, he may not become ritually impure to bury them, as each one may not be his relative. And they, remember, they are also Kohanim, may not become ritually impure to bury him for the same reason. So again, the prohibition on a priest ritually defiling themselves for the dead is maintained in this case, because we can't be sure that he has an obligation to be with them. In the earlier 2 cases of mourning between one and the other, those are permitted because it is not violating an obligation, or sorry, it's not violating a prohibition, it is merely extending an obligation. And so too here, because it is a prohibition, he is not allowed to make himself ritually impure to bury them, and they may not become ritually impure to bury him. He does not inherit from them, as the heirs of both husbands can reject his claims. Right? If you show up at the reading of the will for father number 1, the heirs of father number 1 can say, prove that you have a share in this person's inheritance. And likewise, if he shows up at father number 2, even if he's just been drummed out of father's number 1's reading of the will, the heirs of father number 2 can equally say, prove that you share. The one who comes to take has the burden of proof. And in this case, there was no proof that could be offered. However, on the flip side, they, meaning the fathers, they inherit from him. If he has no sons, meaning if he has no heirs of his own, they will inherit from him, as one of them is definitely the most appropriate heir. They simply split the inheritance between the 2 of them. Continuing on with some of the differences, and he is exempt from capital punishment for striking or for cursing both this father and that one. Although one who strikes or curses his father or mother is liable to receive the death penalty, he cannot be held liable, as it is unknown which of the men is his father. Interestingly enough, the Gemara goes on to say that if he does hit both of them in the same act or curse both of them in the same statement, then he can be held criminally liable for it, because he definitely did hit his father, even if we're not sure which one of them it was. And he definitely cursed his father, even if we're not sure which one. Moving back to the case of just for when they are Kohanim, he must ascend to the temple service with the priestly watch of this father and of that one, as he belongs to one of these watches and is obligated to serve with them. However, he does not receive a share of the portion of offerings that get eaten, as the members of each clan can claim that he is a member of the other watch. So again, if he is definitely a Kohen, but we're just unsure about his father, then he can officiate at the temple. It's perfectly fine for him to act as a Kohen, but he doesn't get to share the bonus aspects of that, because each of the clans can say you don't have a legitimate right to be here, or rather you can't prove it. If both, however, if both uncertain fathers were in one priestly watch, meaning they both happen to be from the families that were on duty at the same time, then he does receive one share, as he certainly belongs to that watch through either Father A or Father B. So it is a lovely little logic puzzle of trying to work out all the permutations, whether it is a Kohen and a Kohen, an Israelite and a Kohen, a slave and a free person, and all of the other permutations. And what are the most common issues that might arise, and how would they be held? How would you hold on the law in these cases where there is such doubt, such safek? And that really is, of course, the answer that we're looking for. The answers to issues that are obvious, such as, can I eat pork? Or do I have to say the Shema? Those answers don't take much time because there's not really any doubt involved in it. But when can I eat, or when can I say the Shema, or when should I say the Shema? Well, that's the reason why it is the first Mishnah of the entire Mishnah. And in this case, we're seeing the extreme example of that, of we don't need to ask questions about what can the son of a Kohen do. Where we do need answers is what happens if we're not sure which Kohen is his father. And thus, Yevamot comes to clarify for us. All right, questions or comments before we leave that behind and move into Mishnah number 12. Or sorry, chapter number 12. All right, not hearing any objections. So let's go ahead and move into chapter number 12, which is going to lay out a lot of the basic elements, the do's and don'ts of the chalitza service itself. So we've talked a little bit more about the do's and don'ts of Yevamot, about the remarriage between the widow and the brother-in-law. But now we're going to look in much more detail about the act of chalitza itself, the act of removing the footwear, the spitting in front of him, the declaration, and thus the freeing of her and him from the automatic betrothal that kicked in when the brother died. So, chapter 12, Mishnah number 1. The mitzvah of chalitza, the ritual through which the Yavam frees the Yevamah of her levirate bonds, must be performed before 3 judges. And the ritual does not require the 3 judges to be experts fit to adjudicate other matters, as even if all 3 are laymen, it is acceptable. So this is something that is, in many cases in Jewish law, not always understood, because there are many cases where it is simply a matter of having 3 people who are the official judges as witnesses, as opposed to properly adjudicating a real case where there will be a settlement of some kind or a verdict. So in this case, you do need people who have the basic skills to be able to train both of the participants, the Yavam and the Yevamah, in what they need to do and what they need to say. But if they are just regular run-of-the-mill Jews who can at least handle the minimum necessary of making sure it is done within the outline of what is proper, then the act of chalitza still counts as being a valid chalitza and thus a valid freeing of the Yavam and the Yevamah. Now, with that as a general statement, we can now understand why the rest of the Mishnah here and a few more on are going to talk about what we call b'diavad situations. So in Hebrew, we talk about b'diavad and lechatchila. So lechatchila is if you want to do something correctly from the start. So from the outset, from the outset, there is the ideal way of doing things. B'diavad means, well, if it wasn't done in the ideal way from the outset, what is acceptable at least as a secondary method of doing it? It's not the preferred way. It is not the official way that it should be done. And certainly if these were three very knowledge and learned judges, they would have prevented any.
Rabbi, your microphone went mute, I think.
I'm trying chat. Hello.
All right, I can hear you now.
Okay, you can hear me again? Where did it cut out?
When you said, it could have been my computer too, but when you said not the best way, but the second best way to do it.
Okay, right. So lehatchila is the proper, preferred, when you're doing it from the start with everything done correctly kind of way. B'diavad is when you've done it something different, but it is still okay. It is okay after the fact. It's not the way you should have planned it, not the way you should have scheduled it. But in certain circumstances, there are acceptable alternatives, but they are acceptable only as after the fact, not the way that you should plan it. So that's what we're going to see a lot of over the next couple Mishnayot.
Rabbi, I had a quick question.
Oh yeah, fine, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, it says even if all three are laymen, is there any commentary if you had like maybe one rabbi who would explain it to two other laymen? Would that be, I mean, much better? Because it seems like they need more factual witnesses than anything else.
Yes. So, I mean, any level of additional rabbinic or scholarly assistance is absolutely ideal and preferred to avoid some of the missteps, if you'll pardon the footwear pun. Having at least one rabbi is absolutely preferred. However, technically, if they were all laymen, as long as they avoid any of the invalid problems that come up later on, then it is still acceptable.
Because at the marriage, you need what, 3 people, a rabbi and 2 witnesses, or?
As an absolute minimum, but actually, technically, you don't even need a rabbi. You just need technically 2 witnesses. However, it is strongly preferred that a wedding be done lechatchila, from the outset, in front of a minyan, that you have at least 10 for the ceremony. But yes, technically, you don't need a rabbi for a funeral. You don't need a rabbi for a wedding. You don't need a rabbi for a brit milah. You don't even need a rabbi for a chalitza. However, all of those things can go wrong and be done in a less than ideal way and can cause some problems later on. The funeral is the one big exception. A funeral is a chance to honor the dead, and certainly we wish to do that as best as possible, but it's hard to have a lasting impact if something is skipped or missed or mispronounced. But a wedding, a brit milah, or chalitza here, all of those could have long-term implications for the people involved.
Yeah, and that's actually why I brought that up. I was wondering why wouldn't they have similar standards, since they can have similar bad effects? I know they're not identical, but...
Well, they are similar in terms of their effects. Chalitza is a little bit more complicated. And in fact, you'll often find in Jewish identity status... You can't hear me? Testing, testing.
I can hear you, Rabbi. Natan, can you hear me? Natan?
Yes, now yes.
All right.
How about now?
Now yes.
Okay.
That's strange. Okay.
Well, it could just be, too much internet usage in the house. Everybody's home, everybody's on devices. It might just be slowing things down.
Yeah, you had like a yellow, all the bars yellow. For 1 second was everything red.
Huh. All right, so let me just get back to what I was saying in response to Aaron's question, is that you'll actually find that the beginning of the change of an identity is often easier than the reversing of that identity. So the classic example is marriage. Marriage is done quite simply in Judaism. You can use a pre-done ketubah that you simply fill in the names and the amounts. You can use a very simple ring, and the witness requirements are not very stringent. and it is very straightforward. Divorce, on the other hand, requires a purpose-written get that is done by a properly trained sofer that follows a very precise set of requirements, and the delivery has to be done very appropriately as well, with much more attention to detail than a wedding, at least the minimum attention to detail to a wedding. It should have plenty, but sometimes people are a bit lax. But the divorce is very precise. Why? Because if you technically mess up a wedding, if for some reason you did something completely wrong, then the two people are not officially married. It's hard to get that point, but it might happen. But that doesn't have a long-term implication. Unlike, as we've said before, unlike European law, where children born out of wedlock have a legal stigma against them, that's not the case under Jewish law. However, on the other end, and with chalitza, this is the same issue. If you say somebody is divorced, but they're not really divorced, and then they go and remarry, well, you've actually just now created adultery. And that is a big problem. That has long-term implications for the couple and very long-term implications for the children. So you need to get divorce correct, and you need to get chalitza correct, because remember, she is not allowed to marry anyone else until this is taken care of. And if she were to do so, those children born from that would be considered illegitimate. So we need to make sure we get chalitza right.
And Rabbi.
Yes.
Back when you said about you're not technically married if you mess up the wedding, if as long as the two people aren't tied to somebody else, once they have relations, that cures any defect, right?
Yeah, not exactly. And in fact, this is a long-standing issue between the Orthodox and conservative and Reform movements. There has been an issue within some communities where a get was not delivered for the dissolution of a Jewish marriage, and one of the members then went to an Orthodox lifestyle, and the Orthodox rabbi said, "Oh, well, don't worry, you didn't need a get anyway, because the conservative or Reform rabbi probably didn't do the wedding right, and therefore you were never really married." So when looking for a loophole, some will decide that the marriage was invalid in the original case in order to avoid having to get a get. But in general, you're right. Judaism holds that if you are acting like you are married, then you have the obligations of being married. But there are some who look for loopholes in special circumstances.
So only for loophole purposes, the relations don't cure defects?
That seems to be the usual attitude, but I'd be hard pressed to say only, because categoricals usually have a way of coming back and biting me. So let's deal with some of the versions that are still okay and some of the versions that are not. So we said in the beginning that to do chalitza, you need to remove a shoe. Now, there is a basic assumption here that the rabbis have made, that the best form of shoe to use is what we would recognize as a sandal. The idea being that a sandal is only a shoe as long as it still functions as a shoe. And if it is broken or has a defect, you're not going to use it or wear it. And therefore its shoeness, its shoeosity, its shoefulness is always perfect. Because no one's wearing a sandal if the sandal's broken. But a shoe that we would recognize as a shoe in the modern world, well, sometimes it's torn, sometimes there are holes, sometimes it's not really any more a shoe, even though you're still wearing it. And so that is what the question comes in this first piece. If she performed chalitza while he was wearing a shoe, meaning instead of a sandal, made of soft leather that covers the whole foot, her chalitza is valid. Again, the sandal is preferred, but a leather all-around shoe is okay. But if she performed chalitza while he was wearing a soft shoe made of cloth, this in our terms would be almost more like a heavy sock, her chalitza is invalid.
Sorry,
As
what is an unpeeling?
so it's a shoe that's made out of wool or felt or some other fabric. It's a non-leather shoe. So think of it like a really heavy sock.
Like a bed shoe, like we use it to be at home.
Like a slipper?
Yes, kind of slipper, close slipper.
Yeah, kind of like a slipper, but you know, maybe even softer, because most slippers nowadays have like a hard bottom. These were basically soft all the way around. But a slipper is not a bad comparison. Good point. So if you use that, then chalitza doesn't count. You have to go back and do it again because it's not a real shoe. If chalitza was performed while he was wearing a sandal, which is the preferred way, that is to say footwear made of hard leather, right? That's the proper shoe, but it has a heel, which is an extra piece to the shoe at the back of the foot, which is a little more than you would usually see. Nonetheless, it is still valid, even if it isn't the Platonic ideal of a sandal. But if he performed with a sandal without a heel, then it is invalid. Now, that actually gets a lot more debate in the Talmud of whether or not this means that it only had a heel or it didn't have a heel at all or nothing. There's a lot of argument about exactly what this piece of the Mishnah is saying in the Talmud, so we're not going to go down into it in much detail, but that's what's talking about the backing part of the shoe. If the leg of the Yavam was amputated anywhere from the knee down, and she performed chalitza as he wore a shoe on the stump of his leg, it is a valid chalitza. If, however, the leg was amputated anywhere from the knee and above, and she performed chalitza as he wore a shoe on the stump of his leg, it is invalid chalitza, meaning the untying of the shoe, the unlacing of the shoe, the loosening of the shoe, the literal verb of chalitza, has to be from the foot. And the argument that's being made is that from the foot covers the leg from foot up until knee. But once you go above the knee, then it's not from the foot anymore. Now it's from the knee. It's a different level of the leg. And therefore, if it is loosened from the calf to the bottom, anywhere in that, that's fine. But if it's from above that zone, then it is not acceptable. Everyone following the logic? Okay. I bet you never thought that you'd wake up today and have to argue about what counts as from the foot when you're dealing with a leg. All right. Mishnah number 2 continues in a similar way. If she performed chalitza while the man was wearing a sandal that did not belong to him, or a sandal made of wood, or on the left shoe, which was being worn on his right foot, it is valid chalitza. Again, none of these things should be done ideally, but b'diavad, after the fact, if this is how it was done, this still renders it a valid chalitza. So the sandal should be his, but it technically says the sandal rather than his sandal, so it can belong to someone else. The sandal made of wood, at least in the Gemara, this is clarified as being a wood sandal that's covered in leather. That still counts as a proper shoe. And on the left shoe, but on the right foot, that still counts as his footwear. It fits him, and therefore it is fine. However, contrary, not however, but also, if she performed chalitza as the man was wearing a shoe that was too large for him, but which he can still walk in, or a shoe too small, but covered most of his foot, her chalitza is valid. Now, the opposite, of course, is also true, that if the shoe is so big that when he walks, it falls off, or if the shoe is so small that it doesn't even cover most of his foot, then it is not his shoe, it doesn't fit him, and therefore the chalitza doesn't work. And then we get a additional slight argument here. If a woman performed chalitza at night, her chalitza is valid, but Rabbi Elazar invalidates it. If she performed...
What's the problem at night?
So the problem at night is we normally do not have court proceedings at night. We don't do a court activity at night. However, there are some courts that do reach a verdict at night. In particular, most monetary courts will hear the argument during the day, and then they will deliver the verdict in the evening. So the first opinion is saying this is more like a monetary court, and thus it's allowed. And Rabbi Elazar says, no, it isn't, and therefore it should only be done during the day. For those interested in keeping score, Rabbi Elazar wins this argument.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Why is one like a monetary court and the other one not?
What do you mean?
Because what was it? One was like a monetary court and it could be done at night, and the other one was like a regular court, which is like rendering.
The verdict of a monetary court can be delivered at night. The actual trial takes place during the day, but the verdict could be delivered at night. And the argument of the first voice, at least according to the Talmudic analysis, is that since this is essentially more verdict-like, that thus having it during the evening would be fine, because this isn't actually like hearing the whole case. The whole case was created by the death. This is just reaching the end. But Rabbi Elazar's argument is no, that this is like a full court proceeding and thus needs to be done in the daytime.
He said Rabbi Elazar wins?
Rabbi Elazar wins, yes.
Rabbi Elazar wins?
He wins, yes.
Wow.
That's okay, don't feel too good. He loses the next one.
I thought at the beginning that he wins because it's invalid, because I thought that people in the night cannot see the shoes when he throws her, because she need to throw the shoes in a way that it fell around the person, and maybe because it's at night, no one see, you don't have enough clear witnesses where the shoes fell. That's why I thought that would be invalid.
The main argument that I saw was more about the nature of which courts can meet or deliver verdicts at which time.
No,
but your logic is a good one.
That was an argument from Natan, no any rabbi, just Natan.
That's fine.
Okay.
If she performed chalitza on the left foot, her chalitza is invalid, but Rabbi Elazar validates it. So the idea of why the chalitza needs to be done on the right foot is taken by a gezerah shava, the midrashic logic of analogy of comparative verses. That when we deal with the mitzora, with a person who is suffering from tzara'at, commonly and incorrectly translated as leprosy, that it talks about also using his foot as well as thumb and ear as part of the purification ritual. And in that case, it is the right foot as well as thumb and ear. And thus too, because of the similarity of verse, this is also going to be the right the right foot. Rabbi Elazar disagrees and says a foot is a foot, but the gezerah shava, the analogy from the verses holds, and it needs to be the right foot.
So the second part, he lost the argument.
Correct.
Must be right.
And when you say he lost, you're referring, is that in the Talmud or is that just in the Midrash?
No, well, it's based off the Talmudic analysis, which is based off the Midrashic logic. So the Midrash will quote parts, the Talmud will quote things from earlier Midrashim, what they call Braitot, as a proof to the argument that they are trying to make. All right, and this is Mishnah 3. Another fun topic. If she, meaning the Yevamot, of course, removed the shoe and spat in accordance with halacha, but did not recite the necessary text. Remember, there was a formula for her to say, thus is done to the guy who refuses to build up his brother, blah, 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 right? If she takes the shoe off and she spits in front of him the way she's supposed to, but she doesn't say the magic words, her chalitza is valid. It still counts.
I disagree, Rabbi. Like,
I thought you would.
Wait, okay, like really, I don't want to be too chutzpah, but it's the same of blessing. If you eat something and you have the kavanah, but you don't recite the blessing for the food or whatever, it's invalid. You didn't do it, so that is the same. The most important part in order to make that happen is the recitation, not just the action. So that's why I think by my logic should be invalid.
So that is going to be a good point to come back to. But let's look at the opposite versions, because they have a couple different varieties of what she does out of the three things. And then we can come back to that point, because I don't want to show you the overall logic that the rabbis are using here until we've seen the alternative varieties.
Okay.
So in this case, she removed, she spat, but she didn't say. On the other hand, if she recited and spat, but did not remove, her chalitza is disqualified, meaning she said what she was supposed to say, and she spat like she was supposed to say, but she didn't actually take off the shoe. The chalitza is not valid. So you can begin to see, well, wait a minute. If she said it, if that was the most important part, then shouldn't that have been enough? But then we get version number 3, about which Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva are going to argue. If she removed the shoe and recited the text, but did not spit, Rabbi Elazar says her chalitza is disqualified, while Rabbi Akiva says her chalitza is valid. All right, we'll get to their logic in just a second, but I want to make sure we see the three versions that are happening here. So version 1, take off the shoe, spit, don't speak. Category or case number 2, speak, spit, but don't take off the shoe. And then version number 3, take off the shoe, speak, but don't spit. And we have the first two seem to be universally agreed that if you remove and spit but don't speak, it is still okay. Again, not ideal, but b'diavad, it's still correct. And version number 2, everyone seems to agree. If you speak and spit but don't remove, that it is not sufficient. They're only arguing about version number 3. So, Natan?
So for Rabbi Akiva, the main part of the ceremony is the shoes. And that is related to the previous Mishnayot that they spoke about the shoes. That's why the most important part is the shoe.
It does seem to be that the shoe is being held as being most instrumental. Now, Rabbi Elazar disagrees, right? So Rabbi Elazar said to him, meaning Rabbi Elazar explains his position. The verse states from Deuteronomy 25, so shall it be done to the man who does not build his brother's house. So is an exclusionary term, indicating that only precisely in this fashion is chalitza valid, right? Do it like so. Do it with the removing, do it with the spitting, do it with the speaking. That seems to be what's being described here in his opinion. Therefore, any term that constitutes an action, for chalitza is indispensable. But what he adds at the end, and which seems to be the underpinning of the first version that we saw, is that he believes, and the others seem to agree, that only the actual action elements are truly necessary in the final analysis. And yes, lechatchila, from the outset, you should do all 3. But if you leave out the non-action, the speaking, but you do the real actions, the removing and the spitting, then that is sufficient b'diavad, after the fact. His argument here, though, is that there are 2 actions, removing and spitting, and thus so shall it be done, do the actions, needs both of them. Now, Rabbi Akiva is going to object to that analysis. But does everyone understand Rabbi Elazar's position? Okay.
That action is more important than recitation.
Exactly. That the action is the action is the action, and the recitation is nice, but it's not a make or break part of the action.
Because come from the be done. Done means action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rabbi Akiva said to him, "You derive proof from there," which is said with a bit of, "Ha boy, you've just walked into it," meaning your proof is going to prove my point, not yours. But it states, "So shall it be done to the man," indicating that only a term constituting an action toward the man is valid, namely any aspect of chalitza that concerns the man's body, such as removal of his shoe, is indispensable. But spitting, which does not involve the man, although it takes place in his presence, is not indispensable. So for Rabbi Akiva, technically, just removing and saying would technically be enough.
That's removing the shoe would be enough.
Yes, removing the shoe and doing the recitation, doing the saying the speech, that would technically be enough for Rabbi Akiva, because doing the action verbs are only the transitive verbs. They are the verbs that happen to the man. And since the only verb that happens to the man is the removal of a shoe, that is the essential element based off that verse.
Yeah, but why recitation?
But Rabbi, why does he need to say it too then?
Why recitation?
I'm sorry, Aaron, go first. I think you started first.
I was gonna say, why is the recitation necessary then? Because that's definitely not an action.
Well, it's necessary at all because the Torah said to do it. Right? The Torah says that you need to make this recitation. So the Torah has outlined what we call lechatchila, the ideal version of how the ceremony is supposed to work. However, Jewish law needs to deal with but what if scenarios all the time. And in this case, the but what if for Mishnah number 3 is saying, but what if not all the elements were there? Are we going to say chalitza was valid or invalid? And in this case, they're saying, well, under this circumstance, it's okay. Under that circumstance, it's not. Go ahead.
I thought Rabbi Akiva already agreed that if you remove the sandal and spit, you did not have to say the recitation because it did not constitute an act. Or was that just Eleazar?
No. So Rabbi Eleazar is saying that the essential elements are the ones that are done, which for him are removing and spitting. And Rabbi Akiva is saying, actually, it's only the elements that are done to him, which is the removing.
All right.
But everybody had already agreed that the reciting was technically not necessary back in the first version that they discussed.
And that's what I was wondering. If the reciting is not necessary, how come it gets added in if you don't spit? How does not spitting make it necessary?
Well, it's not a question of not spitting making necessary. This is a question of, well, what if they did it this way? It's not that the spitting reactivated the speaking. It's, well, what happens if this is the report? You know, the judge or the lay people come to the rabbi the next week and they say, yeah, Rabbi, we had a nice chalitza the other day, sorry. We had a nice chalitza the other day. It was really good. You know, we didn't have any of that spitting. She just took it off and said the speech, but we skipped the spitting. Then Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva go, well, wait a minute. Is that okay? Is that valid? And they are adjudicating on what happened.
So potentially just taking off the shoe would be enough for Rabbi Akiva.
Possibly. Now, there is some problem with that, which would be there still needs to be an acknowledgement that what's happening is actually chalitza. And you don't do chalitza just by removing a shoe randomly sometimes. There needs to be some intentionality going on here. So I'm assuming that they're holding in the text here as just a reminder of what's being done. It's just like with a wedding, that you can give a ring to any woman, but that doesn't mean you're married unless you've actually proclaimed, by this ring, you'll be married to me, and she accepts. So there does need to be a little bit more context to make sure. So if you just walk up to a guy, take off his shoe and say, haha, now I've done chalitza, that might be more problematic. All right, let's see if we can squeeze in Mishnah 4. Or actually, Natan, you had a question as well. Was it the same question?
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so Mishnah number 4. Get some introduction. This Mishnah lists additional halachot with regard to chalitza. Well, obviously. If a deaf-mute underwent chalitza, or a deaf-mute woman performed chalitza, or if an adult woman performed chalitza with a male minor, her chalitza is invalid, and the woman may not marry. So you may remember from other classes, we've talked about the case of a cheresh, of somebody that is legally deaf-mute. A reminder for those that are unfamiliar with the status of people in the ancient world, well, really the pre-modern world, who were deaf-mutes, where they often were deaf-mutes from either birth or a very young infancy, and thus were unable to develop in a full mental capacity in many, many instances. We should be very thankful for the advances that have been made for helping people with this situation to live wonderful and full lives. But in the ancient world, the technology and the techniques were not available. As such, they lacked the ability to engage in legal actions that had legal implications, because it was impossible to be able to ascertain what was their real intention, what was their real awareness, what was their real faculty with the situation going on. The same with a male minor. The child may not fully be able to cognitively understand the implication of what is taking place. And as such, chalitza done in one of these cases would not be considered to be a valid chalitza. Now, on the opposite side, if a female minor performed chalitza, meaning she was the minor, she must perform chalitza a second time once she becomes an adult.
Rabbi, I think you froze.
Hello? Hello?
I can see perfectly.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Wow, the internet's
Yes,
really...
I'm okay. I can hear you, Rabbi.
All right, Natan, you're okay. Aaron, am I back for you yet?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, it's just bad connection all around tonight. If a female minor performed chalitza, meaning she's the minor, she must perform chalitza a second time once she becomes an adult. And if she does not perform the second chalitza, her first chalitza is invalid.
The same logic as a tua.
Exactly.
When she was married as under minor, she need to remarry, ask permission again after that. The same logic.
Exactly. A minor can be betrothed, but it needs to be ratified. It needs to be officially made official once they reach maturity. Because even though it can be put in place, it cannot be finalized until you have people that are of legal age to make legally binding decisions for themselves. All right. Make sense?
So, Rabbi, you said a minor cannot do chalitza, so he could be technically bound to her for a long time, or no?
She cannot do chalitza on a minor. So if she is a woman and the brother-in-law is 5 years old, she technically can't do chalitza with him. She has to wait until he becomes of age, which, yes, is a problem.
So she could be bound to a 5-year-old for 8 years just to perform chalitza and then be unbound?
That is the situation, yes.
Oh.
Now, as we've talked about at other times, more tangentially, there are ways to dissolve the original marriage, to do hafka'at kedushin, to uproot, to annul the original marriage to the original brother. So in a case where there might be a 13-year wait, the brother was born 2 days before the brother-in-law was born 2 days before the brother died, then the court might try to find a way to release her from being waiting for 13 years. But technically, they would need a method to release her. You can't just hand wave it away. All right. Why don't we go ahead and leave it there? We'll pick up with Mishnah 5 next week. And we do have Mishnah class next week. A reminder, I don't have my Lunch and Learn Torah class next week because of my daughter's graduation, but we will be having Mishnah class next Wednesday evening.
And Rabbi, and one more question.
Before July.
And that'll be the last class before July, I believe. Yes.
Rabbi, if you annul a marriage, though, doesn't that have other issues that would take effect? Because it'd be like the children were born out of wedlock, right?
Which, as I mentioned, is not such a big effect under Jewish law. It's not as I've joked a little bit before. It's no great shame to be born out of wedlock, but it's no great honor either. To paraphrase from Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. Under Jewish law, the implications of children having been born from just two consenting adults who weren't married having sex is nothing like the implications of European law for most of the last couple thousand years. So yes, it's not ideal, which is why it's not done recklessly, but the implications are not nearly as dire as you might be imagining.
All right. And Rabbi, how can you annul a marriage, back to that loophole scenario, how can you annul a marriage when they clearly had intercourse given by the children?
Yeah, because you say that the marriage wasn't actually a marriage, it was just people having sex. It's literally turned into what's called znut, promiscuity, to use a fancy English word for it. That they were just fooling around for 20 years together and having 3 kids. And it's a technical form. And the basic logic that's used is that when a person gets married, it's Kedat Moshe Yisrael. It is according to the laws of Torah and the laws of Israel, meaning the standards of of Judaism. And if you have, for one reason or another, violated the standards, or those standards need to be altered, then the court has the power to retroactively rescind its stamp of approval on the original marriage.
But what happens to the ketubah?
It would be null and void officially.
So if you were to do that annulment, the woman would be deprived of her ketubah.
And that's why these things are not taken lightly, especially in the pre-modern world where the ketubah was a very important financial document. But if it's a choice between collecting and waiting 13 years, sometimes it's the most humane option. All right. Take care, everyone. I will see you next week, if not earlier for other things.